G7 leaders turning their focus to China on the final day of their summit in Italy. They're hammering the CCP over its support for Russia and harmful trade practices that threaten the global economy. Joining us now live is NTD's White House correspondent Iris Tao, who's on the ground at the G Summit in Italy. Good evening, Iris. Great to have you with us. What are the biggest takeaways from the leaders' final statement earlier today?
Good evening to you, Steve. So in this final joint statement from the G7 leaders here in Italy for the G7 summit, it really shows how leaders of the world's 7 wealthiest democracies are now creating a united front against an increasingly aggressive and ambitious Chinese Communist Party. The leaders, including President Biden, issued their starkest comment and warning yet to the Chinese Communist regime, accusing it of enabling Russia's war in Ukraine. And that strong language comes after President Biden on Thursday called out China for its role in the war. Watch.
China is not supplying weapons, but the ability to produce those weapons and the technology available to do it. So it is, in fact, helping Russia.
The U.S. this week expanded its sanctions on Russia to stop China from supplying Russia with materials used in the war. And a senior administration official told us tonight that it marked a key shift in U.S. sanctions strategy. And in addition to China's ties with Russia, the G7 leaders are also toughening up against China's unfair trade practices, saying China is leading to global spillovers, market distortions, and harmful overcapacity. And it comes after the EU just days ago announced new tariffs on Chinese EVs, and after President Biden just last month announced a massive hikes on tariffs on Chinese EVs, semiconductors, as well as the steel. Let's take a look. Watch.
It's not competition, it's cheating. And we've seen damage here in America. To name one example, back in 2000, when cheap steel from China began to flood the market, U.S. steel plants across Pennsylvania and Ohio were hit hard.
And the G7 statement also hammers China on what it called militarization in the South China Sea, malicious cyber activity around the world, and the human rights situation in Tibet, Hong Kong, and Xinjiang. Meanwhile, President Biden is now on his way back to the U.S. after his 3-day trip to Italy, and he will be attending a campaign activity in California this weekend. Back to you.
G7 leaders agree to using frozen Russian assets to help fund Ukraine's defense. But there were some disagreements among the allied nations. Amela Khan is the senior White House correspondent at the Epoch Times. She's been following these world leaders at the G7, and she joins us now. Amela Khan, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, Amel, being at the G7 summit, if you could sort of take us beyond the headlines, what is the underlying, or I guess the most important issue that you're hearing and seeing surrounding these meetings? And, is it the war in Ukraine, the threat of China? Give us some insights.
There were a lot of decisions during this summit, and I think the biggest headline was the use of Russian assets to benefit Ukraine. I think they reached an agreement, and I was surprised actually because U.S. officials tried to lower the expectation before the summit. They said that we are hoping that we will reach an agreement and issue a statement about how to use frozen Russian assets that are in the European accounts and how we unlock that and use it to grant loans to Ukraine. That was the lowest, I would say. I think that was the hardest thing to accomplish during the summit, and they reached an agreement, and that was the surprising part. After reaching an agreement, of course, there was another obstacle, and we heard today that there was a disagreement over how to state the issue of abortion rights in the communique, and we learned that they reached an agreement, and Italian press was writing about this, and the host of the summit, Giorgia Meloni, the Italian prime minister, basically excluded the language about abortion in the final draft. So those were the interesting part, in my opinion. And of course, some of the leaders headed to this summit with a big defeat. As you know, on Sunday, they learned that their parties lost big, especially to far-right parties in Germany and France. And I think you can see from their body language, the way they act, I think there was some kind of sad impression on their faces. And that was interesting for me to watch as well.
The so-called 2-2 presser yesterday between Zelensky and Biden. This is where they only allow, I believe, 2 questions from American journalists, 2 questions from Ukrainian journalists, so very limited questions. What do you make of Zelensky's reply when asked about China, and even more so, President Biden stepping in to underscore the CCP's culpability in aiding and abetting Russia's war effort in Ukraine?
To me, it was very surprising. For the first time, we see both leaders talking about China and giving message to China about its help to Russia, Russian industrial base, defense industrial base. And President Biden, if you saw him after Zelensky responded that he said basically that he spoke with Chinese leader Xi and he trusts him, and he said that basically Chinese leader Xi promised him that he's not sending weapons. And right after that, President Biden wanted to say something that actually was really surprising to me. He wanted to say that China is indeed helping Russia in this war, and he wanted to make it clear and send a message to Chinese leader Xi during that summit.
That he knew that the CCP was aiding and abetting Russia, despite the fact that they're promising that they're not, at least on the surface.
Exactly, and this was also in the final communique. We just saw that they put that China is basically sending not weapons, but they are sending all the components to build those weapons and the technology behind it. So I think that's the key message that this G7 leaders wanted to give during the summit, and which was different than last year's communique.
Epoch Times' Amela Khan, really appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Russian President Vladimir Putin today issuing conditions for ending the war in Ukraine. The United States says Putin is in no position to set conditions for peace. NTD's international correspondent Arian Pazdar has the story.
Russian President Vladimir Putin on Friday gave conditions to end the war in Ukraine. He said Ukraine has to drop its NATO ambitions, hand over all 4 provinces claimed by Russia, and demilitarize itself. He said Western sanctions against Russia must also end. Ukraine quickly rejected the offer, saying it would amount to a surrender. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin also commented.
Putin has illegally occupied sovereign Ukrainian territory. He is not in any position to dictate to Ukraine what they must do to bring about a peace.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky today suggested Putin would continue the aggression even if Ukraine accepted the deal.
In 2014, when Russian occupation started, there was talk about Crimea and Donbas. Today, he is talking about 4 regions. He calls Ukrainian lands Russian territories.
And lastly, a U.S. attack submarine arrived at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba today, and a Canadian Navy patrol ship sailed into Havana in support. That's after Russian warships arrived at the island, which lies just 100 miles off the coast of Florida, earlier this week. This comes as tensions between the US and Russia are at a historic high. Arian Pazdar, NTD News.
Thank you for watching the Capitol Report. If you want to see our full broadcast, check us out at epochtv.com.